Hi everyone, welcome back to Talks in Class. I'm Jenna. Thank you so much for joining me today for another episode. I'm back from my mini break. The pod was off last week, so very mini break, but I'm back and I'm still in Wisconsin. You guys, I basically live here now. I'm kidding. I do not live here actually, but it does feel a little bit like it. Though I have been here for a while, so it kind of feels like I live here, but my mom and I are getting a ton of stuff done. As some of you guys may know, I do come visit pretty often to help my mom out with stuff because she's here by herself. And it's difficult when I come for just a week or two, which is what I usually do. I usually come for, I would say, about a week and a half. And, you know, 2 of those days are spent traveling back and forth, the flights, and then I have to keep up with my own work, obviously. And usually I want to do even more work. I want to create even more content because I am quite literally surrounded by nostalgia when I'm here. And then maybe I want to see a friend or do something fun. So it's just hard for us to really get stuff done. And then every single time, without fail, towards the end of my visit, we're panic cleaning out a closet or trying to cram in appointments or trying to squeeze in one last little thing. So this has actually been less stressful to just kind of have this longer period of time where we can do things and then also live life in between, and I can work obviously. And it is also cheaper for me to fly here fly less often and come for a longer period of time, so it's fewer flights because these flight prices are getting out of hand. I don't know if anybody else out there flies pretty frequently, but I thought maybe it was just a blip and it's just not changing. So this is working a little better, but regardless, I'm still here, still hanging out in the time capsule bedroom. And I need TV show recommendations, you guys, because it is hard enough for Hubs and I to find things that we both want to watch together when I'm at my actual home, but it is really hard to find stuff for my mom and I to watch together. We just don't like the same TV, I guess. She loves a comedy. She loves a sitcom, which I don't know. It's just not my favorite. I love a good true crime documentary. The more horrific, the better. Jaw on the Floor gets 10 out of 10 for me. I love trashy reality TV. Again, the trashier the better. I love anything on Bravo. And mom just doesn't appreciate that. She's not a fan of Vanderpump Rules. I tried. Here's a great example. I put on Bridesmaids last week because I think that movie's hilarious. She loves a comedy. I've seen it probably 15 times and I howl laughing every single time. I think it's so funny. My mother, she's not like a clutch her pearls type of person, but this is not her type of comedy. She was not impressed. I believe her exact words were, "This is sick." I failed on that pick. So I don't know. She loves Friends. She likes Grace and Frankie. So anybody out there, if you like that kind of TV and you have recommendations, please send them my way. As always, I will kick off the episode with my what good happened. And this week, it really is just that my mom and I have been super productive. It is a good feeling, you guys. It really is. You know those things you put on your to-do list and you're like, I'm going to get to that someday. We are actually doing those types of things. I mean, it makes me feel like an adult. It makes me feel very accomplished. I did some fun stuff too and also worked. There is the work part also. I promise. I have been working. So for this week's episode, I wanted to expand on kind of a few different things that I feel like comes up pretty often when I talk to people around my age as we watch our childhoods and teen years come back into fashion and kind of be discovered by the younger generations. It's a weird feeling for sure, because it makes you realize that you have been around on the planet long enough for that to happen to you. But also there is this feeling of something's not quite right about the way that it's coming back. And I have a lot of thoughts on that, which I will expand on in this episode, which is all about life in the 2000s, social media versus reality. As we know, nostalgia for the 90s and the 2000s is massively popular right now and has been for the past few years. And there are plenty of things that I think contribute to this. It's actually something that I want to do a full episode on at some point. Just the power of nostalgia and why I think nostalgia is so massively popular right now with our specific age group, what it does for us and kind of all of those things. But regardless of the reasons behind it, there is no question that it is very, very popular amongst millennials right now, this sort of nostalgia for our younger years, you know, all of our younger years. But on top of that piece, there's this 20 to 30 year fashion cycle that is making fashion from the 90s and the 2000s currently trendy with young people, which, yes, millennials, it has actually been 20 to 30 years since we were wearing those things back when we were young. It's not a joke. As hard as this is to hear, it's not a joke. It's not too soon. It's actually right on time with that traditional trend cycle to be seeing fashion from the 90s and 2000s come back now. As upsetting as that is, trust me, I know, I feel it too. But the fact that all of these 90s and 2000s fashion trends have come back into style recently in this really big way has also created interest or desire to know more about those time periods in general for young people. And I always make this comparison because millennials, love you, but some of you forgot. Some of you have forgotten we didn't invent these trends either. And we are guilty of a lot of the same things that I see millennials kind of hating on Gen Z for. When we were kids, we did this to our parents' styles and things that they had and liked and knew when they were young. It's that vicious cycle that makes generation after generation feel positively ancient when it happens for the first time. Like, it is truly a shocking experience. And Gen Z and Gen Alpha and every generation after them will experience it too in their own time. But right now, it's our time. And I get it. It's hard to deal with. But when I look at the younger generation suddenly having this fascination, this interest with the 90s and the early 2000s, it reminds me so much of my own obsession with the 60s and 70s when I was a kid in the 90s and 2000s. But I remember being a kid, sitting in my inflatable chair in my late 90s bedroom, but I was wishing that that inflatable chair was an egg chair. And I would cover everything in peace signs and flowers. And I was wearing low-rise flare jeans, which my mom called hip hugger bell bottoms, because low-rise flares was our rebrand of the hip hugger bell bottoms. And I was obsessed with stuff from the 60s and 70s. You know, I loved my mom's old records when I was young. I loved watching TV from the 70s, like Nick at Night would show those old shows, or however we watched them. They were still accessible at the time. So when I see these younger people now with their digital cameras or they're looking at CDs next to me at the flea market, it reminds me of me in 1999 listening to my mom's record with my little lava lamp going in my bedroom. We are the same, you guys. It's a cycle. But just like we blended 60s and 70s styles together in ways that our parents never would have worn when they were young, when those things were trending when they were young, and we made a lot of just generally incorrect assumptions about what life was like back then. I mean, when I think about it, I think I thought everybody's life in the 70s was like the Brady Bunch, because that was the thing that I had as a point of reference for what life was like in the 70s, was like cheesy sitcoms. So just like we got a lot of stuff wrong in our interpretation of what life was like before us, the internet's obsession now with the 90s and 2000s also does get a lot wrong. And some of this comes from the natural tendency to exaggerate for comedic effect or parody, right? This is especially true of nostalgia social media content, which is what I create. So I know this very well. And if you look at most nostalgia comedy content online, it is purposely very exaggerated. I mean, most comedy content, especially parody content, that's the point. It's very exaggerated. Like, did I do my makeup perfectly in 2005? No. Did my foundation perfectly match my skin tone in 2005? Hell no, no question. However, was it 6 shades too dark with a hard line around my jawline and then like a deep raccoon eye of eyeliner and half a tube of lip gloss? Also, no. And also, nobody that I knew in real life actually looked like that either. But that exaggerated look of the makeup, the too dark foundation, it represents things to those of us who were there. It represents a time when our makeup options were really limited. So we probably did have the wrong color foundation because there just weren't that many to choose from. It represents a time when we also didn't know what we were doing with makeup because we didn't have resources. We didn't have YouTube makeup tutorials. We had the Mary Kay lady in town, or like maybe somebody's older sister who was trying to teach us how to do makeup, but she also didn't know what she was doing. It represents a time that we were really obsessed with being tan, like to an unhealthy degree. And also a time when the trends in general just leaned really fake. It was very over the top. Natural was not in. So is it technically accurate? No. But it feels accurate because it represents all of those things that we remember from the time. And, you know, that's why we do things like that. That's why we exaggerate them for a fact. That's the point of the content. So when I think about my own content, it is all based on my own experiences. I don't think I have ever created a piece of content that wasn't, at least in some way, directly derived from an experience that I had in my real life. Even the characters, all of the different characters that I have created in my short form content, they are based on myself, at least to some extent, or at least they're based on some aspect of myself. But the character becomes a very exaggerated version of those aspects of myself. So like, it's real, but it's not real. Just like everything on social media, really. So there's no surprise that the throwback content online is not necessarily painting a realistic portrayal of life back then. Just like when I watched The Brady Bunch as a kid, that was not portraying life in the 70s accurately. But another big reason that I think we get a lot wrong when thinking about the past now is the tendency to just romanticize the past a little bit too much, maybe give it a little too much credit. We look at the past with rose-colored glasses, and this is totally normal, I think. I mean, this happens to every generation. I remember when I was a kid, my grandparents, like I would roll my eyes constantly at my grandparents doing this kind of like looking at the past through rose-colored glasses type of stuff. You know, my grandma would start in and be like, well, back in my day, and immediately as soon as I heard those words, like my eyes would roll so far back into my head thinking, here we go again. And she'd start going on and on about how great the world used to be and how the kids today, you know, everything's bad. Never mind the fact that my grandmother was young during the literal Great Depression. So I'm sorry, Grams, but it couldn't have been that great. So the same thing I think just happens to all of us as we age, because when you're an adult, stuff sucks. It's stressful. Like there's this natural tendency to look back at childhood as more carefree, just an all-around better time. And in the case of the early 2000s, that's pretty inaccurate in a broad sense. Obviously, everybody's individual experience will be completely different. But in a very broad, zoomed out sense, saying that the early 2000s was a better or more carefree time than now is pretty inaccurate. The early 2000s was a time of massive fear and uncertainty. Even if we back up to the 90s, like late 90s, the internet really shook things up. Like it changed life in a lot of ways, and people in general just don't do well with change. People don't like change. They fear it. We even had stuff in pop culture like The Terminator or Smart House, that Disney Channel movie, which was essentially about technology gone wrong and like horrible things that could potentially happen because of technology. Then, of course, we had the Y2K scare, which I did a whole podcast episode about not too long ago if you want more on that. And then, obviously, in the early 2000s, we had 9/11, followed by the Iraq War. Later in the decade, we had the financial crash of 2008. It was a really scary time. It was not a good decade when you look at it from that perspective. There was a ton of fear. There was a lot of unrest. Looking back now, I think the best way that I can describe the mood, the overall mood at the time was, the world is scary. Everyone out there is scary. Like the world out there, whatever out there means, is scary. And this was a time when we had a huge rise in pop culture with media that was like Stranger Danger or like invasion movies, themes like that. War of the Worlds, Hostel. The message kind of seemed to be the others, whatever that meant in the context of that particular media, are bad and they're scary and they are out to get you. And I mean, there's so much to unpack there, but again, at a very high level, it was just that's a scary environment if you think about to be living in day to day. So it's wild how just 20 years later, like it hasn't even been that long,
We have this overwhelming messaging happening on social media that, right now is such a scary, uncertain, wild time. But the early 2000s, when we were young, that was a good time. It was simpler then. It was a better time. It was a much less scary time. And sure, in some ways, yes, it was better. But in a lot of ways, it wasn't better. We were just less aware or maybe less impacted because we were young. We were carefree by virtue of being young, not because of what was actually going on at the time period. I've also noticed this phenomenon where our memories have become skewed over the years, and I think that this is a big contributing factor to kind of these inconsistencies, we'll say, with how we look back at things now. Whether it's just due to time or it's a subconscious impact of maybe watching a lot of this exaggerated parody type content that we consume now, or maybe it's the effects of our own emotions or whatever it is. People remember stuff wrong, just incorrectly. It happens all the time. I do too. It's happened to me so many times, and it always catches me off guard when it happens because I can be so sure of something and then I realize that memory is wrong, and it's like, oh my God, how can my own memory be wrong? And I've mentioned this before, but I am so fortunate to have so many pictures from growing up, and I use those a lot to piece these memories together. So there have been times when I thought I had a specific memory. I was so sure. Like, I remembered being at a certain place or a certain event during what I thought was a certain time period, and then I'll end up finding pictures from that event and come to find out it was like 3 or 4 years after the time that I thought it happened. Or I'll think I remembered owning a certain item and I remember what it looked like, or I think I remember what it looked like, and then I find a picture of it and it's actually a totally different color. It's so crazy, but this happens all the time, and I think these things definitely contribute to this sort of Instagram versus reality split between how we remember and how we talk about the early 2000s now versus how it really was when we were living it at the time. Of course, one of the primary examples of this, which I talk about all the time in my own content, and I also see other people talk about all the time, is the fashion. And there are two main points to the misrepresentation of early 2000s fashion that I see contributing to this the most. The first is obviously the exaggerated nature of social media and nostalgia in general, I think, which makes sense because obviously if we're going to talk about fashion from back then, we're probably going to pick the most memorable options to talk about rather than the more boring, bland, realistic, everyday versions of outfits that people were wearing. And I see a lot of people talking about this exaggerated version of 2000s fashion on social media, especially recently. And I've seen it described a lot of time as Disney Channel star fashion. So the recreations that we're seeing now are not necessarily real outfits. They're what celebrities were wearing. They were the celebrity interpretations of the trends of the time, which does feel pretty accurate to me. It's essentially taking all of the most extreme or most memorable aspects of the trends of a certain time period and putting them all together in one outfit, which is not how real people dress in the real world. And I don't know if you guys have seen them, but there are these videos I see circulating around social media, and I don't even know where they originated from, but they're just footage, like actual footage of real high schoolers in the early 2000s. So they're not recreations. It's just like somebody must have brought a camcorder to school and somebody somehow got a hold of the tapes. But it's just normal kids, they're waving at the person who has the camcorder in the hallways of their high school or sitting in the cafeteria or whatever it is. And those videos give me a completely different sense of nostalgia. It's a very different reaction that I have to those videos versus like a parody. It's a much more emotional reaction when I see that because it's real. It feels authentically, genuinely real, not representative of the time. Like when I watch those videos and I see kids just wearing a plain hoodie with some bootcut jeans and barely any makeup, no Juicy Couture, no orange foundation with the line on their face, no acrylic nails or Von Dutch or spray tans or any of that exaggerated stuff. It's just normal everyday kids. Like that's what I remember. Those are the kids that I knew. That could be me and my friends. It's like truly looking back through a window into time in a very different way than watching that sort of exaggerated parody version in an outfit recreation. But there's a reason why the nostalgia videos don't recreate real outfits that most of us wore. It's because like those were kind of boring. They were boring outfits. They weren't interesting like a Disney Channel star. Now, I personally was a little extra in my own fashion sense, so I wore some weird stuff. sometimes. I wore a purple fur-trimmed duster sweater that went down to my shins to high school. I had graffiti painted pants, which I wore to high school in a rural Wisconsin farm town. I had a hot pink mini skirt that I wore with big chunky platform shoes and like some sort of tank top with a word on it. I don't know what it said, but something probably borderline inappropriate. I had those Von Dutch jeans that said Von Dutch huge across the butt. But even those outfits, like even those more extra outfits that I wore, they weren't an everyday occurrence. Those were like once in a while. For the most part, my friends and I dressed really simple. Most of the time it was just kind of regular medium wash, not distressed, boot cut jeans, probably American Eagle or like LEI, I don't know, flip-flops, a basic brown leather or cloth belt, and then a simple tank top or a t-shirt. Even the layering has become so exaggerated on social media. I can say with 100% confidence, the only time I ever wore more than 2 shirts at once was in 2005 when I was going through my very strong boho phase, and I had this one outfit that was this long lace tank top because I wanted the lace to peek out of the bottom and at the top. And then I wore a ribbed tank top over it that was brown, of course. And then over that, I wore this kind of like slouchy off the shoulder dolman sleeve shirt. So it would like hang off of one shoulder. That was the only time I put on like that many layers at a time of just shirts. Most of the time, to be perfectly honest, through the early to mid 2000s, I just wore one top. I was just wearing a shirt. If I was doing a layered look, it was one cami, usually a lace trim cami or one of those really tight built-in bra ones from like American Eagle or Express maybe, and then just my regular shirt or my sweater or whatever it was over that cami. But I love the exaggerated looks that I see in these recreations. They remind me of the media that I watched as a teen. If we're calling it teen star, Disney star fashion, it reminds me of those celebrities whose outfits I wished I could wear. The celebrities whose outfits I was taking inspiration from to create my boring, Midwestern teenage version of it. And some honestly don't even remind me of anything that I truly experienced in real life, but again, just represent things about the time period that feel familiar, feel funny, feel nostalgic, and they're fun, even if they're not necessarily accurate. The second thing that I think contributes to this new interpretation of 2000s fashion, this less historically accurate interpretation, is the fact that when trends come back around, they don't come back in the same ways. Things change about them, and also trends move at different rates. So everything's not going to come back at the same time with the same other trends as before. The result of this, of course, is what we see now, where the term Y2K has now become a blanket term to refer to anything, any trend from roughly, like 1996 up until about 2010. And styles from all of those years are blended and kind of worn together, mixed and matched, and trending at the same time. When in reality, as in the reality of what it was like for those of us who wore that stuff, like back in those days, Y2K means year 2000. So that refers to a pretty narrow window of time and a pretty narrow subset of fashion trends. And a lot of the fashion trends that now fall under that term of Y2K were not popular, were not even widely known during the year 2000 for sure, or even kind of the Y2K era leading up to the year 2000. And a lot of these things, obviously from such a wide window of time, the mid-90s to 2010, were not popular at the same time the way they are now. For example, the Juicy Couture sweatsuit, which has become synonymous now with Y2K, was released in the year 2001, so obviously that's not the actual year 2000, it's a little bit after. And then it took a couple of years to gain momentum. I think by about 2003, I would say, we saw celebrities wearing them really frequently, and they were recognizable. But even so, it then took even longer for them to reach the masses, and then it took even longer for them to trickle down into more affordable versions, knockoffs. So to me, based on my own individual experience from that time, Juicy Couture sweatsuits reigned supreme from about 2004 to about 2008. But of course, these specifics fade with time, And it makes sense that nostalgia now would kind of condense these things in these ways that brings the most exciting parts and the most memorable parts to the forefront of our memories while kind of ignoring those like more boring, mundane, average parts that were happening in real life back then. But just let me go on the record by saying that my friends and I did not look like teen stars in the 2000s. Like, not even close. We looked like kids from a small Midwestern town who didn't have much access to things beyond our little rural Midwestern bubble, because that's what we were. That was our reality. I never even owned a real Juicy Couture sweatsuit because, first of all, they were like $200. And that would have been absolutely insane for anybody where I lived. But also because the closest place that probably sold Juicy Couture would have been at least a 2-hour drive away. So we just did not have access. So instead, I wore the generic velour sweatsuits from whatever mall stores that were close to me sold, you know, probably Express or maybe somewhere like Vanity or Deb. They weren't real Juicy, but they were like, you know, a close enough knockoff. And while we're on the topic of access, another thing that I think has kind of been misinterpreted in hindsight is just our interaction with and our relationship to technology in a general sense. First of all, the way that the internet now talks about the 90s and early 2000s, like there's some ancient civilization, like it hurts me. But also, I guess, technologically speaking, may as well have been ancient times because the technology truly was so different. Things truly have changed so much in the last 20 years. But just because we basically had Stone Age technology doesn't mean that life was completely devoid of some of these problems that we now see as being dependent on or caused by technology. There is this tendency to think about the early 2000s as this wonderful, unplugged time when everybody was just being present and was disconnected from their devices and living life. And I mean, that is in large part very true in some circumstances, right? But I need to make this really clear. We were obsessed with the internet back then, okay? Obsessed. From the time my household got a dial-up internet connection in the 90s, I was addicted. It was over for me. All of my friends and I, we were addicted to it. And it was even worse in some ways if you think about it because we didn't know anything about it. Like, nobody knew about the internet. We didn't understand the impacts of this stuff on things like mental health. I mean, nobody was talking about something like screen time. I mean, nobody was talking about mental health in general while we're at it, but, you know, that's a different conversation. There were no safety measures in check for kids on the internet. It was just like a Wild West. There were no, you know, content filters. It was just kind of like, whatever you find out there, you better deal with it because it could be some wild stuff and, you know, you don't know. And then once we moved from dial-up to DSL or whatever was the earliest version of the internet that didn't tie up the phone line, we were online literally all the time when we were home. And now this seems like common sense because we're literally online all the time. But in those days, it was a computer, which meant that we were physically like checking the computer all the time when we were home. My friends and I were obsessed with checking constantly who was on AIM, what their away message said, how many minutes they had been online or hours, how many minutes they had been away, so we could try to figure out like where they were, who they were with. Like we would compare, like this person has been away for this many minutes. This person has also been away for this many minutes. Maybe they're like hanging out. Like it was the same thing, just a different flavor. You know what I mean? It was like stalking someone's social media now, except we just had way less information to work with, so it wasn't as interesting. But it was the same reliance. It was the same obsession that was absolutely there. The big difference, though, was that the internet was not mobile yet. And honestly, that was beautiful. We were absolutely much more present when we weren't at home. Absolutely. That part is totally correct. Our devices were so basic, there was no reason to look at your phone when you were out unless you were physically making a call or sending a text in that moment, which we rarely did because it was really expensive. We didn't want to get in trouble, you know, we didn't want to get grounded for going over our texting limit. So whenever real life communication was an option, we took that instead of the reliance on the phone. I was thinking about this, and I very vaguely remember when I started to bring my phone with me to high school and actually like keep it turned on during the day versus in the early days, I just put it in my locker and it probably wasn't even on if I even brought it to school. But even in those days when I started to keep it on and like keep it on me during school, unless somebody was not at school, like if a friend was homesick or something, I didn't use my phone to communicate with any of my friends during the school day because I could just go talk to them in the hallway and not risk my parents getting hit with some texting overage charge that I was surely going to get in trouble for. So, you know, the phones were there, but they weren't our first choice for communication the way that they are now. And even though technology was rapidly changing at the time, it is actually crazy when you think back on how much technological advancement happened just during my teen years. Like just during those short years that I was a teenager, we literally went from dial-up internet and those Nokia brick phones that could do pretty much nothing to MySpace and camera phones in a few short years, a very short span of time. So even though technology was changing really quickly like this, very few people that I knew made a point to keep up with technology in a really consistent way. It was really expensive to keep up with new gadgets, you know, new phones, whatever. It was expensive. And I was always a couple of years behind on things like new phones because my mom just wasn't going to pay that kind of money just so I could have the latest version of the flip phone or whatever. But also, I would say up until about 2005, we just really didn't care. I think around that point, that mid-2000s point, was the first time I remember there being kind of status symbol phones, like the Sidekick, the Razor for sure. That was the first time I remember seeing a phone and being like, I want that specific phone. And I never had either one of them because, again, it was expensive. But before that, when I was in high school, people just didn't care what phone they had. They truly did not care. And I feel like there's so much nostalgia content on social media and so much conversation about nostalgia that made it seem like these devices were kind of our whole personalities. Like if you had a Razor phone with a ringtone that you downloaded, it was this huge thing. But then they simultaneously paint this picture of a generation of kids who were not bound to their technology, you know, just living carefree in the moment live. And really, the reality, of course, lies somewhere in the middle. Neither one of those things were completely true in my experience anyway. In a lot of ways, it was the same as it is now. It was nice to have the latest phone, but unless you were somebody who just really cared about that stuff and really liked to keep up with that stuff, you were just happy to have a phone. And of course, our access to the internet was much more limited, but we were still totally obsessed with it. You know, we were just fortunate that we couldn't take the internet with us everywhere we went because we had these primitive phones. But just because we didn't have social media the way that we do now in a constant access state that we do now doesn't mean that we didn't have a lot of toxicity or bullying or that there wasn't pressure to conform. There absolutely was. It was just different, of course. Now that pressure is constantly fed to us via social media. Obviously, we know this. But in the 2000s, that pressure was still really real and you felt it. It was just more in real life. And because we didn't have social media, if you didn't like the mainstream stuff or whatever was readily and widely available to you wherever you lived, it wasn't as easy to seek out those things that you did like, right? You couldn't find niche communities or like niche content as easily. I think MySpace was the first time that I remember feeling like there was super easy and readily accessible access to like not basic stuff or less basic stuff, you know, that access to something that wasn't totally basic became mainstream with MySpace, especially for people in places like where I grew up, like small towns in middle America. We did not have access. And while we're on the topic of toxicity, we have to talk about the deep diet culture of the 2000s. And I'm going to keep this part pretty high level and brief, but if you don't want to hear about this, just go ahead and skip forward a little bit. The 90s and 2000s are very glamorized now, of course, but I do really appreciate how the younger generations, even as they're glamorizing those time periods in a lot of ways, they are quick to point out some of the more problematic things like the diet culture, and they're not playing that game, which is good. I appreciate that. But I have to really stress this. If you weren't there, I think it's hard to understand truly what it was like or how bad it was. I was there. And at the time, I had no idea. I didn't realize how bad it was because it was so pervasive and it was so normalized and we just internalized it so much. There was no woman over like 120 pounds on television, okay? And if she was, it was because she was there to specifically have people comment on her weight. I remember America's Next Top Model had a plus-sized woman on one of those early seasons, which I think this has recently kind of gained traction again on the internet, but she was a size 6, you guys. A size 6, and she was plus-sized on America's Next Top Model. I still have these vivid memories of the way that Kate Winslet was torn apart by the tabloids when Titanic came out, and I think this is my first kind of conscious registering of the body image and the diet culture that was really pervasive in the 90s. They called her Kate Weighs a Lot in the tabloids. Like, I don't know if you've seen Kate Winslet, but in what world? And every single female celebrity was torn to shreds in the tabloids at some point for something related to her weight, whether it was that she gained a little bit of weight or even she just wore something that made her look just slightly larger than she usually looked. It was wild. And the food stuff, like speaking of actual diets, the food stuff was beyond. Do you guys remember those Yoplait commercials with the teeny weeny itty bitty yellow polka dot bikini? They literally said in those Yoplait commercials that eating Yoplait yogurt will burn fat so that you can fit into your bikini. And this is what we were watching on TV, probably in the commercial breaks when we were watching America's Next Top Model, where Tyra Banks was calling a size 6 woman fat. And then there was stuff like Snackwell's cookies and 100-calorie packs of everything. Those were really, really popular. Every snack had a 100-calorie pack. There was the Special K diet. There was the Slim Fast diet. And then there was the freaking Subway diet. And then it was Atkins. And it was just like so many diets. Like there was a new diet every month. And everybody knew somebody who jumped on every single fad diet. Somebody's mom, somebody's aunt, whoever. But the scary thing about this, again, is that this was so normalized. Like, when people talk about low-rise jeans coming back and millennials look like they've seen a ghost, it's because we are having flashbacks, deeply embedded flashbacks of some 110-pound celebrity woman being called fat in some disgusting tabloid because she had 1/2 inch of skin hanging over the side of those ultra low-rise jeans. And we cannot go back to that place. We just can't. And while I don't think that this is necessarily misinterpreted in nostalgia conversations, like I said, I do give the younger generations a ton of credit for identifying this stuff and doing their best not to glamorize it for the most part. But I do think that it is missed in a larger conversation just how intrinsically this all was tied to fashion and pop culture at the time. So any conversation, when we're talking about low-rise jeans, or we're talking about short denim miniskirts, or we're talking about juicy sweatsuits that were low-cut, or we're talking about Paris and Nicole and Lindsay and Brittany, or any of the other it girls at the time, there is inherently a part of that conversation that is directly tied to body image and how deeply rooted the importance of a very specific body type was during that time period. And lastly, as much as I am really nostalgic for the times I spent just killing time with my friends, I think the internet now drastically underestimates just how freaking bored we were a lot of the time. And we could have a whole separate conversation about the value of boredom and how it probably did benefit us to be bored. But again, this is so glamorized now on social media and in nostalgia content. I think it goes back to this longing for a less connected world, a world where there's less pressure coming at you at all times, where you could turn some of that pressure off at least. You know, you could disconnect. It was easier to be present. But at the time, we did not see it that way. We were bored. We probably had one family computer that had to be shared amongst every member of the family. You had to share it. You also had to share the TV with everybody in your family, probably, or at least somebody in your family. Most of the time, we were out of minutes on our little cell phones. We were over our texting limit. If you were lucky, you had access to a car as a teenager. And this is why we spent so much time just aimlessly driving around. We also didn't have money, or at least my friends and I didn't. So I think the idea of doing things like going to movies and shopping was a bit exaggerated, at least for my experience too, because even though a movie was like, I don't know, $6, like imagine doing anything for $6 now. But even though it was only $6, we'll say, That was like a quarter tank of gas for me when I got my license in 2003. So if it came down to taking that $6 and either putting gas in my car so I could drive around aimlessly for an entire night listening to music with my friends, or going to a movie for 90 minutes of entertainment, like I was choosing to put gas in my car and drive around. And this is what I mean when I say we were literally so bored. We would just go wander around Walmart and just cause havoc. We'd ride the little kids' motorized Barbie Jeeps around until some employees scolded us, or we would try on all the ugliest clothes we could find. Sometimes we would make up these scavenger hunts where we would assign ourselves lists of things that we had to do. And I remember one time we were doing one of these in the mall. And one of the tasks was that we had to take a picture with the guy who worked at Spencer's. And I still have that photo. But I mean, this is the kind of stuff that we did. So like, maybe we shouldn't hate on the Sephora kids too much, because honestly, my friends and I were probably just as annoying because we were freaking bored. And of course, in hindsight, I am somewhat grateful for this, right? It forced us to be creative. We created some fun memories. We were present with each other. But it also led to some very questionable choices, some that you guys have heard about and some that I will probably take to my grave. And there were secrets back then, thank God, because not everything was documented. Thank God. So many nights full of mischief, no photos, definitely no video. And that is such a glorious thing in hindsight, you know, just kids with a 3-year-old cell phone that was basically out of minutes, driving aimlessly around our boring hometown, wearing our boring bootcut jeans and our boring basic t-shirt, wishing that we had something exciting to do, not realizing that we would someday be nostalgic for exactly this type of boredom. And speaking of our boring bootcut jeans, I'm going to wrap this up with my favorite type of list, which is an outfit list. And since I think fashion is the most commonly misrepresented aspect of life of the early 2000s, I'm going to share my favorite normal everyday outfits according to year from the early 2000s. Number 1 is 2001. In 2001, I was extremely into the sort of boho meets Western vibe that I really blame almost entirely on the movie Coyote Ugly. I was also really into like the Y2K business casual thing. I remember owning a pair of gray pinstripe pants that I wore with like a lace tank top. But my favorite outfit, hands down, in 2001 was this dark red Lucky brand asymmetrical tank top. So it had the one strap and then a big graphic on the front in kind of that Western, very Lucky brand style. And I think it had rhinestones on it too. I was so obsessed with this top and I've been scouring the internet for one of them and I haven't been successful so far, but I wore it with a pair of Abercrombie jeans that were called Dirty Wash, which is exactly what it sounds like. And sometimes I would even add like a leather fringe belt and a pair of brown leather sandals. Icon. She's an icon. She's a legend. Or at least that's how I felt. Number 2 is 2002. My obsession with the Western boho thing extended into 2002, but I also started leaning heavily into the whole like Abercrombie vibe around that time. I remember wearing a lot of just basic pullover Henley style sweaters and things like that. And for some reason, a lot of red in 2002. One outfit that really stands out to me from 2002 was this tan colored t-shirt from Express that had rhinestones on the front that said, I think it said ooh la la. And the background was kind of this collage pattern that sort of looked like that Paris antique Moulin Rouge pattern. And I wore this with a pair of Tommy Hilfiger jeans that had this really skinny waistband. I don't know why I remember that specifically, but I loved them. I also got a Penny Lane jacket in 2002, which I absolutely adored. And I wore that outfit with my Penny Lane jacket and this pair of brown leather boots. And I wore my hair flipped out at the ends and I felt like a literal rock star. 2003. My vibe in 2003 was one part 70s disco queen and one part Abercrombie and one part like 2000s boho surf aesthetic. I used a lot of John Frieda sea salt hair scrunching spray around this time, if that kind of gives you an idea of the vibe. I had these jeans in early 2003, speaking of like the 70s thing. They were skin tight. They were so tight. They were dark blue and they had this big built-in denim belt with a big round belt buckle and no back pockets. Like, I was wearing Cher's jeans thinking I was looking so original, but it actually was kind of a cute look. I wore those jeans with the Wooden Candies shoes, obviously. But my favorite outfit in 2003, hands down, was a summer outfit. It was a pair of ultra low-rise white cargo pants They were from Abercrombie. And then I would wear it with some sort of graphic tee or tank top from a surf brand like Roxy or somewhere like Abercrombie. And then my clear plastic rimless, rectangle sunglasses, the ones that have become totally synonymous with the early 2000s now. I also had a Playboy Bunny belly button ring in 2003 and probably a matching Playboy Bunny tanned right onto my hip. Number 4 is 2004. And if I had to pick one year that is the epitome of high school Jenna in pretty much every way, like friends, hobbies, memories, style, it's definitely 2004. By 2004, I had really leaned into that whole Abercrombie kind of like classic girl next door thing, but with a very heavy boho tilt to it. And honestly, that core aesthetic has kind of carried through all the way to my present style in a lot of ways. It was a lot of like really basic outfits with boho accessories, or maybe something like a studded belt, like something a little edgier. I did love my studded belts. But I remember around this time having the realization that jeans and a white tank top was the perfect outfit. Like, it was the outfit that made me feel most comfortable, most confident, most like myself. And honestly, I still kind of agree with that. So it's really, really hard to choose one favorite outfit from 2004 because so many of my favorite outfits that feel so quintessentially Jenna, and also some of my most extra outfits also came from 2004, but I'll stick with a very basic look that I loved, and it was ultra low-rise jeans in some like overly faded wash. There's one pair in particular that comes to mind, and I'm pretty sure the brand was Dollhouse. They were definitely from Gadzooks, and they were so low. They were so low. So those jeans with a brown tank top. I wore so much brown during this time. It is unbelievable. My favorite brown tank top was kind of like a boat neck, sleeveless tank top with brown flip-flops and then some sort of jacket, usually like a corduroy, like tan corduroy jacket, or maybe I had a denim jacket with fur trim. And then maybe I would add a necklace with some sort of flower or like something hanging on a brown strap. And that was the look. And then we have 2005. 2005 was a big fashion shift in my mind. It was the explosion of a lot of the styles that we now see most commonly associated with the 2000s, like the super long shirts and the gaucho pants and sequin shrugs and like the low slung belts on the hips. For me, 2005 was just brown, a ton of brown. I mean, I love brown now, don't get me wrong, but I wore so much brown in 2005, and I have the pictures to prove it. And also turquoise, and also orange. That was the color palette of 2005. So anyway, in early 2005, I turned 18 and I got a job at Express. So I had a very good wardrobe for my small Wisconsin town. And one outfit I remember being really, really proud of myself for was a pair of dark denim capri pants that I wore cuffed, like with the big chunky cuff. And then I wore them with this like turquoise beaded tank top that had beading all along the neckline with a brown shrug sweater over it, usually with flip-flops. But if I was really dressing up, I would wear this pair of brown wedge sandals with it, or a pair of those brown kitten heel mules with like the beading all over the top. Oh my God, I am mortified thinking about those shoes. I thought they were so cool. I was also really minimalistic with jewelry up until about 2005 when I really leaned into the like really overly accessorized boho thing, like Nicole Richie, Rachel Zoe style of the time. A lot of bangles, a lot of really big earrings. I routinely wore giant chandelier earrings with just a plain tank top and jeans. That was a whole look. I loved that look. And while I do love the exaggerated, fun outfit recreations that I see now, thinking back on these simple, like real life, everyday looks will always make me feel the most nostalgic because it reminds me of how things really were at the time. So I hope it brought back some good memories for you as well. I hope you enjoyed this episode. It's always a fun time, and I so appreciate you all tuning into the podcast. Don't forget to rate and review. That really helps me so much. And subscribe so you never miss an episode. And I'll be back next time. Talk to you then. Bye.